Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the Nexus Center's first post-lockdown event of the winter semester. My name is Isabelle Cote, and I'm the director of the Nexus Center here at Memorial. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. And I'm very pleased today to be welcoming you to this roundtable on infographics and data visualization for academic and non-academic audiences. For those of you who are not quite familiar with the Nexus Center, the Nexus Center has been created 4 years ago with the goal of fostering interdisciplinarity in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences for both faculty members, but also students. And while in the past we have been very active in organizing seminars, workshops, and things of that nature on campus, well, during the pandemic, we've shifted a little bit of our role to match the needs of students and faculties in pandemic world. And one of those needs we've noticed was a desire to better understand how to communicate our research to audiences outside of academia, and how to communicate our research in different ways, not just with papers, articles, books, but also how to grasp and make our family members, make the general public, and make our colleagues also understand what it is that we do, largely with the help of visuals, data visualizations and infographics being two of them. So today I'm very happy to be presenting you, or to be welcoming a great lineup of people who have over the years accumulated a really close understanding and experience, expertise, I should say, on data visualization and infographics, both from within academia, but also outside of academia. And so in order of our speakers, following the same order that they'll be speaking, I'd like to introduce first Nicole Labossière, who's a consultant manager with Gus Gilroy here in St. John's. Then we'll hear from Kathy Newhook, who's a manager of engagement and communication at the Harris Center here at Memorial University. Then we'll hear from Dr. Liam Swiss, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Memorial, who teaches and does research on international development, gender, globalization, and research methods. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Michaela Swain, who's a second-year MA student in biology, who studies the cascading and direct impacts of moose on soil composition and microbial communities. She's also the professional development coordinator of the Biology Graduate Students Association here at Memorial, and that's how she's become interested in infographics and how to find ways to explain complex research topics to a general public. So for today, what we'll do is that each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. And following that, then we'll open the floor to questions and comments. You're more than welcome to use the chat function that you can see to drop your questions or your comments at any point. Or if you prefer, you can also send me a personal message and I'll start building up a research a question list. I should also clarify that this session will be recorded, or is being recorded, I should be saying, and so that our colleagues who have not been able to join us today will be able to catch up on the discussion. And before going any further, I realize now I have not yet made the land acknowledgement, so if you allow me, I'll do it right now. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit of this province. So without further ado, then, I will pass the baton to Nicole Labossière, our first speaker, to kickstart this conversation. So Nicole, you can
take
I'm
it from the host.
Here. Yes, you are.
Thanks very much. So I'll just share my screen here. So thanks so much for inviting me today. I'm one of the ones who will be bringing the non-academic perspective. I work for Goscory. We're a consulting company in St. John's. We work mostly doing evaluation of programs, especially government programs and for community organizations, as well as other research things. So I'll be talking sort of about the basics, and then I think the other speakers may be kind of expanding a bit beyond that. So my context is a bit about writing reports. So I'm going to give you an example. I'll take you now to this report that I came across last week when I was doing some research, and I don't want to pick on them because I've seen many reports like this, but this is the one that I came across. So it's a public-facing report. It is written by academics, but it's on the Manitoba Court's website, and it's an evaluation of the Winnipeg Drug Treatment Court program. So good article, really interesting. I'm only criticizing its data visualization. So this is something that obviously it is geared somewhat at least to a public audience. So here's my example of what maybe we don't want to do. So, okay, executive summary, single-spaced, all together, okay. So when we get past the executive summary, now we get into the double-spaced. And I know that is the academic norm. I have to admit, I'm still surprised that it's still the academic norm from back in the days when we used typewriters. But okay, here we have our first visualization, not too bad. Nicely labeled, got some shadows in there, don't know why. Now a nice pie chart, it's a little easy to understand. Okay, a table, it's colored, but it's just a lot of numbers. It's the kind of thing you could put in an appendix if it's not geared to, say, a publishing, you're not publishing this. I mean, for the public, it's something to consider. Okay, also here, so they're writing about their drug of choice of their participants. Now this pie chart is black with many colors. It's got some dimension. The next one is completely different with black thingies for the labels. There's actually mistakes in there when I went looking at it. Is it easy to understand? Okay, so this is people's drug of choice and second drug of choice. How come we can't just look at that together? Like you have to kind of read in there and kind of see, okay, and cross-reference from the bottom there to which side, which pie does it relate to? So I think you get where I'm going. Again, here we got more charts, but formatted differently in different colors. More pie charts, again, some different formatting. Now there's some background and there's fading. So that's the sample of, could be improved. So let's go back to the presentation and discuss some ideas for what we could do to improve data visualization. And these are the things that I kind of primarily think about. Think about your audience. When they're looking at your visual, how easy is it for them to understand? And the few things I'm going to go through here are just the basics of decluttering your graphs and thinking about both color and font in your report, like not only your graphs, but the cohesiveness of your report overall. So here's an example. I took some data from StatsCan and I used the default settings in Excel to graph it. And I accepted a lot of the options. And so as you can see, it's got some dimension in there. I've got an extra, like I've got the legend and all this. How easy is it for you to look at that and take away a message? See what it's saying. Here's an example of what we could do with that instead. Same data, same everything, except we changed the formatting a bit. So I ordered it so that the highest, so that it's in order, decreasing order, so that it's really visually easy to look at and say, okay, PEI has the highest percentage of immigrants and Newfoundland has the lowest. And you can just see that as a glance much more easily than having to interpret. You also don't have to cross-reference to the bottom to see, okay, what is the percentage for Newfoundland? Because we put it right there by the graph. In this case, we've also kind of got a header where we're telling people what we intend for them to take away from the graph. Now, you don't always want to point out something like that, but it can be handy when you are writing a paper and you're interpreting a graph and you're wanting to say, look, PEI is the Atlantic province with the highest percentage of immigrants. So that's one example. So again, these are some principles. So I would say, yeah, present the graphs and visuals so that an audience can tell what it means right away. And you want to avoid these non-useful extras. Like if it doesn't really have a use, doesn't help in any way, shading, 3D, doesn't really help most of the time. The thing with color too is think about a consistent color palette throughout your document. So if you're doing one graph in one set of colors, do the next graph in the same set of colors. And you know, if you're talking about, say, the 4 provinces, well, maybe you have one color for each province through all your graphs. It just makes it easier for readers to follow. One thing I didn't mention in the previous graph was that color here. You know, I colored PEI in blue to make it stand out because it was the point, and the others in gray. So the info's still there. It's just presented a little more clearly. Colorblindness is something to keep in mind. A lot of dashboards use red and green for stop and go, and yellow. That is difficult for definitely certain types of colorblindness. I find thinking about how it will print in black and white, and whether if you print this in black and white, will you be able to tell what's going on? So even if you can't tell between your colors, you might want to be using like more saturated colors and lighter colors so that when it prints out, you can see the difference. Or if you are suspicious that your colors might not show well, maybe make sure you're labeling them well so that if you can't tell what's going on by the colors, at least you could read the labels and figure out what's going on. So more often than not, I have to say I use a lot of bar charts, and I find that that is often the most simplest. And sometimes, but you know, trying to vary things, sometimes, you know, you don't want to necessarily vary things for the sake of variation and do fancy charts for the sake of being fancy, but you also don't want 20 bar charts and people's eyes to glaze over. So sometimes presenting things in slightly different ways can be interesting. So here was my experiment with, I did this sometime during the past year to show that since COVID-19 hit, the number of non-resident travelers to Canada has been lower. So this is called a Lollipop Chart. So you see the gray dots there are 2019 and the blue dots are 2020. So you can see in each month the difference between where we were at last year and we were at this year. Here's another example too. I find one of the things is keeping experimenting. It does take, almost the more simple you get your graph, the longer it takes, because you are trying different things. You're trying to see, how does this visualize best for me? So here's one that I did a little bit ago where we were talking about a survey where people had answered from, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 was extremely in agreement, 1 was not. And I was kind of, you know, trying to see how can we best visualize this. So I'm thinking, well, people read from left to right. When you have long categories that are hard to shorten, I like to put them left to right as opposed to up and down, because up and down you end up getting like a little thingy, you know, it's hard to read. I like to put the legend so that it kind of parallels the viewpoint of your chart. So as you can see, I tried to put it, it doesn't fit perfectly, but you know, if you look above from, say, the first dark blue, look above to the dark blue category, and you can kind of take your visual line of reading the chart or reading the legend is the same as reading the chart. And so the idea here is that the people in the darkest blue were very much in agreement. The slightly lighter blue was not so much in agreement, and so on. And the reds are there. I used red to make it be, you know, say, look, this is a difference. This is alarming, kind of, not alarming, but, you know, these people said no, so it's different. This, I don't know if the difference between that dark blue and that dark red would show up well in black and white, but I've put very clear labels on it so that you could easily sort of see, and it's also ordered there. And as you can tell, I've also ordered the graph from the biggest to the smallest. So again, it's sort of easy to look at and say, what was the one which people were most in agreement with? This is another fun one that I really like, and I find I like it visually. So this was a graph showing what percentage of French speakers in different provinces in the West are immigrants. So the gray is the number of French speakers in each province. And so you can imagine it like a glass, and then the color is the number of French speakers who are immigrants. And so it's almost like water in a glass, right? You're seeing how far your glass is full. So it's a way of showing, part of a whole. So I've actually used numbers here. So you can see in the left axis, it's numbers. I've also added in percentages. So, that does take a minute to kind of figure out what's going on there, but I think it gives you multiple forms of information. This tells you both that Alberta has the highest number of French speakers, but that BC has the highest percentage of its immigrants who are, a percentage of its French speakers who are immigrants. This is another one, similar sort of idea, percentage of a total. So here is showing the percentage of people with an Indigenous identity. So the percentage is highest in Manitoba here, and the little slightly lighter colored, we're keeping the same color scheme, but it's slightly lighter up top to say, this percentage of French people with an Indigenous identity, 18.3% are Métis, and another 1 point something are other Indigenous identities. So that's the idea there. So I find often using shades of one color can also be really helpful. Here's from we did a survey for one project, and sometimes you write 2-3 pages worth of characteristics, reporting on the characteristics of the people in the survey. In this case, our client said, can you just write it they called it a dashboard, which again, the terminology, people use terminology in very different ways. To me, I wouldn't call it a dashboard, but that was what it meant to them. But we got the sense that what they wanted was, all in one page. So here's a way, this was one page in our report where we were able to say, okay, at a glance, here's a way where we can look at the different characteristics of your respondent. So we're still able to include details like the sample size for each different question. And we tried to keep the same color palette and vary things a little bit for interest because it's all together and you probably don't want 7 bar graphs all together. Down here, we've got, I was running out of ideas and I thought, well, to show proportion, I've got little, we're 61% male, so I've got 6 little people and then 39% female, so that's about 40%, and I've got 4 little people. And then, well, if I could have done maybe a half-colored person, I could have done that there just to say that it's half of a person who identified as transgender, which sounds terrible, but I mean half of a percent, sorry, half of 10%. Here's another example, same sort of idea. The map, I included this one to share about the map. So this map was done with Excel. Excel has this thing, you put in your stats and it gives you a map. It's got work to do. It's not the greatest, the Excel function, but hopefully it'll be getting better. Here's something where I went to an actual thing online, that a free software that produced, you could color things in by census division. And so I did that. It's, maybe I would have changed some of the formatting, but it was a great tool for that. So actually, I think that's the end of the stuff I was going to go through. And so thanks. So I'm going to pass to Kathy, I think is the next one. So we've got to pass around the hosting duties, apparently. So pardon me while I take a sec to do it.
That's okay. It'll give me a second to try and figure out how to share my screen eventually.
There you go. You got the hosting
right.
duties.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to share my PowerPoint and all All right, I got to move some stuff around. Sorry, I'm two screens and it's always great, but then it adds confusion. All right, are you guys seeing that okay now? Are you seeing the presentation or are you seeing my notes as well?
Notes as well.
Ah, see? Always happens to me. All right. Let's try this one more time. How's that?
Much better.
All right, there you go. I've had many experiences where I've only been able to share my notes and then I have to go it alone, and either people can read all my notes or they don't get to see my slides. Anyway, I'm glad we fixed that. So I'm Kathy Newhook, as Isabel mentioned. I work at the Harris Center. And I have been involved in the Vital Signs Project since the beginning. And some of you may know what the project is, but the Harris Center has been doing this project called Vital Signs for about 6 years now. And essentially it's a quality of life checkup on the province. It allows us to cover all sorts of topics from health to education, economy, employment, you name it, we cover it. And it's a mix of infographics and stories and expert blurbs and whatever else we feel like throwing in there. So it's a really fun project to get to work on, for sure. It's a ton of work, of course, but it's exciting. So Vital Signs it's actually a national concept. It was developed by the Community Foundation of Canada, and it came out of Toronto. Actually, the Community Foundation of Toronto was the first one to start the project. So it's a national concept, but it gives local content. So there are, I think, around 85 communities across Canada now that have a Vital Signs report, either annually or every couple of years. And it is, they say, the most extensive community-driven data program in Canada. And of course, it's an annual quality of life report that measures how communities are doing and showcases the different current local data, but also lots of citizen engagement projects and that sort of thing. So that's the overall project. What we do in Newfoundland and Labrador is a little bit different. I think it makes it a little bit more neat. So it's actually a partnership, the partnership between the Harris Center at the university and the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador was the only partnership of its kind for many years. But actually it's been really sought after partnership because the Harris Center, with utilizing memorials, resources and ability to be able to produce such a thing. The Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador is very tiny. They have one half-time staff person, so they're not able to kind of produce something like this on their own. So we volunteered to do it and actually help fundraise to make it happen, and we're full partners in the process. So that partnership has actually been modeled elsewhere in the country as well now, and PEI is another place that does that university partnership with the Community Foundation to make their own Vital Signs reports. So kind of neat. It's garnered a lot of attention, and I think it's funny because people say, oh, I Vital Signs is on my desk and I use it all the time and it's such great data. And I'm thinking the data is actually not that new. It's not unique data. We don't create, for the most part, we do sometimes, but for the most part, we don't create data or research that is our own. We just republish data that most of it is just StatsCan data that you can go on StatsCan and you can pull it yourself and read it, but nobody does. And instead, they just keep Vital Signs on their desk so that they can reference it whenever they need to figure out what the population decline has been, or what does migration look like, or what are the health stats in the past year. So it's a unique approach, and I think that's what really brings it the strength. So it ties different types of data that you wouldn't normally see together in one document. And of course, it's visually appealing, which is key for us because this ends up on the kitchen tables and boardroom tables and offices and classrooms across the province. So it really needs to be visually appealing and interesting to pick up and read. I always find it great when I go to my in-laws after Vital Signs comes out and it's there on their kitchen table and they want to talk to me about the different pieces that went in it, but they would read it regardless of the fact that I was the one who helped pull it together. So they're just the kind of people who would find that interesting. It comes in their paper every year. It's published through Saltwire and it ends up in all of the newspapers across the province in addition to being launched online. So I guess the key point here is that it's relatable stories and easy to understand, and it's all pulled together in one document. So that's what is really neat about it. But I'm going to dive in a little bit more specifically. So it's interesting information that's in there. It might not be unique information, but it's interesting, and it's pulled together in an interesting way. And it's interesting because we spend a ton of time thinking about what is interesting. So I spend months thinking and wondering and talking and listening to people, trying to figure out what people are wondering about. What are they thinking about? What do people want to know? And then we look at how we can present that in an easy to understand way. So that I think is really key. Instead of just presenting what your findings are, you present what people are thinking about. So trying to understand, trying to figure out what is it that's really interesting of whatever your research is to other people. What would make your grandmother sit up and go, oh, really? That's how interesting, how intriguing. And so we try and think about, and I ask myself tons and other people around the table, what's the story we want to tell here? What's the story we're getting at? What's the thread that's going to carry through the document? What's the thread that's going to carry through each section? So we talk a lot about storytelling and kind of threading that overall picture together. All right, so we use a lot of images to try and catch people's attention. And I think this is a really important part. It seems sort of silly that, we use photographs, but it's really important because if you're communicating and no one's listening, then what's the point? We might have lots of things to share, but we need to catch people's attention. So, and photographs are a really easy way to do that. And they do silly things or simple things like give your eyes a break, and they break up the text. But photos in and of themselves also tell a story, and they allow us to set the tone within a report or within a document that we're producing. So it's a matter of, you're looking at show people, don't tell them. So you use infographics to do that. But I also like to combine that with photos to kind of give people visual cues for what the content is related to. And and of course, then we get to the graphics. So here's the Village of 100, which we do in every edition. We did it the first time, and it received a lot of positive attention. So we thought we will do it again. And again, this is one of the funny things that we do and people get really excited about. But it is just straight up StatsCan demographic data, of course. And anyone who's a researcher, we don't need to explain how this is pulled together. It's very easy, but sometimes it's complicated what you're trying to put in there. But it's a great way to just sort of capture the audience's attention right from the get-go to kind of show what it is that Newfoundland and Labrador looks like if we were just 100 people in a village. But it's really, the crux of this one is that we've boiled it down, so this is a way to kind of look at data, to get out of your own head and boil it down. So this is the type of stuff that we work with at the beginning. So when we start kind of thinking about what people might be thinking about, I ask, we have a data person in-house, and she pulls all the data for me. And then comes the difficult part, because we could just publish a bunch of charts that include all this information, but they'd be completely ridiculous and hard to understand. So we take a lot of time to try and boil it down, and again ask ourselves that question: what story are we trying to tell here? People don't need all the information all at once, all in one gulp. But if you give them a little snippet, they can always ask you for more information later. But the point is, you really need to catch their attention first. So kind of pulling out the neat things that are worth telling initially. And so this data chart here, this spreadsheet, is essentially what informed this page. And so you can see that we've really pulled out what are the important threads. We didn't include all the occupations. It would be just too much. You know, perhaps we would be criticized for saying you didn't pull out enough, but, you know, people can find the information themselves. We put all the sources in there. They oftentimes will follow up and ask us a question about other groups that we didn't include or something like that. But you can see we also, in addition to the infographics here, which even just do basic cues like which ones are going up and which ones are going down. Instead of showing the year-over-year data, we were able to just indicate which ones are growing and which ones are declining. But then we pull that together with a piece here from Lynn Gambin to kind of explain, what does this look like? Why are certain occupations going up and why are they going down? So she takes a really quick view about the skills of the future that informs this piece and ties the whole bit together. The other trick that we use is many rounds of edits. So we talk to a lot of people throughout the process, but we also rely on a lot of researchers and even friends and family to help us figure out what's making sense and what other questions exist. So they might look at an early draft and say, yeah, but can you tell me this piece of information? And that really helps us kind of flesh out what needs to be included in order to get the whole picture. There's a graphic designer who pulls together all the graphics for us each time. And it's a ton of back and forth work with that person to try and get the graphics right and also make sure that they're accurate. Because graphic design and data interpretation and research are all different skills. So when you're trying to combine all those, it's important to have a bunch of people looking at them. So we make sure that a lot of researchers look at, and a lot of people who understand data look at the infographics to make sure that they're represented properly. But also, like I said, average folks who can just say, you know what, that's interesting, but can you tell me this? Or I don't understand what that chart means. And you're going to have to do it a little easier for me than that. So, you know, use your friends and family for stuff like that. How am I doing on time?
2 minutes.
Okay. Let's see. Overall message on the infographics, and I think Nicole talked about this as well, is keep it really simple. You know, don't overthink it, and just try and tell the quick little snippets that are interesting and most interesting. And I love the idea of doing, in addition to a report, doing like a public document. So if you think about a report, you don't need, I know researchers love to have reports, and they need to have reports, and you need to have all the information in that any other academic who wants to, you know, look at it or read it or understand it, it's all there. But having a standalone 1 or 2 pager where you've pulled out the little threads that are interesting in a way that's graphically appealing and easy to understand and digest is really helpful. I think, you know, not just for your average folks and for being able to kind of communicate that knowledge to a more general audience, but also for an academic audience as well. I mean, you know, everyone gets sick of looking at pages and pages of text. I can't believe I'm the only one who gets sick of reading pages and pages of text. So I think it does us all a good favor to kind of look at pulling out the key information and what's shareable. And it'll go a long way in terms of knowledge mobilization too, and making sure that your research is getting past the academic audience and getting into the hands of maybe policymakers or industry folks and other people who need to see it. We also use these little explanatory blurbs. I know they're not unique to vital signs, but I police these like nobody's business, because these cannot be complicated. They need to be, if I can't understand what this big picture is saying, then tell me in a sentence or two, but no more, in very, very plain language, what that means. So that's not an excuse. This little space is not an excuse to throw in all the jargon that you can't throw in the infographic. This is a way to explain even more simply than the infographic does what the message is, what's the key takeaway. So, and we also use lots of different titles to kind of break up the text as well. And we try to use titles that are not long academic titles. And that's a struggle sometimes because we still exist within a university. So I think the Harris Center tends to be like king of the colon title, you know, the fancy thing that says like just a headline, you know, a quick grab headline, and then the colon and a really long explanation of what the event might be. So we use that a little bit in vital signs as well, but we have a bit more freedom to get away from that. So we also have lots of stories, and I think, again, this is about data visualization. So stories are sort of secondary for this conversation, but I do think they play an important role in helping people kind of understand the full story of what your data is saying. And so as much as possible to try and get at a nice personal story that people can kind of relate to within the data. Stories are also where people see themselves in reports like this. And if they don't see themselves in it, it's hard to engage really in the content. And this is especially important when you're talking about knowledge mobilization and not just, you know, communicating findings. So what it all boils down to, and I promise I won't go too much past my 2-minute mark. So why does it work? It's all about knowing your audience and telling them a story. I mean, know your audience. That's like communications 101. It's blah, 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 blah. Yes, of course, we all know we need to know our audience. But it's not enough to just know who they are, but you also need to really get inside their head. And I think that that's one of the things that when you spend time thinking about what are people wondering, what are people thinking, spend some time to get inside your audience's head. Don't just say, okay, well, my audience is, you know, women between 40 and 75, or my audience is the general public, which is the worst possible audience, you know, because there is no general public, right? But trying to figure out who is that public audience, who is that audience you're trying to talk to. And let's see. And storytelling, of course, that's the new buzzword. But it's really simple. It's, you know, it's thinking about what story we want to tell, what thread is there, really forces us to be linear and clear and keep it simple. So, just even asking yourself that question when you're developing data or a publication is really helpful, I think. Stories are how we make sense of the world, and that's a key piece in all of this. So here are two practical, helpful things that I have found. The Harris Center, we often talk about good, fast, cheap, pick two. You know, you can't have it all. So here are my good, fast, cheap, pick two options. Canva, we use this a ton. So vital signs, we go out to, you know, we actually get a graphic designer on contract and work with them over the course of, you know, a month and a half or so, to get those graphics nailed down. But the rest of the year, I'm on my own, and I'm not a graphic designer. But I use Canva, and it's super easy. And the basic level is free. My 11-year-old uses it all the time. She has the best presentations of any 11-year-old. And so there's really easy ways you can get in here and poke around. You can make some great infographics in here. It's not so great with like a ton of data, but really simple infographics is perfect. And like I said, there's a version that's free, and there's also the next up version is still cheap. So that's good. And the other one that we use a little bit, and it's better for lots of data points, you can upload your own Excel spreadsheet, is Visme. And Visme is excellent for graphs and charts and presentations. It's a little bit more complicated to use than Canva, but It's really helpful. And they have a ton of webinars and kind of how-to guides for creating interesting graphics. And they talk a lot about some of the stuff that Nicole talked about in terms of, making sure that your color palette is nice and simple, making sure that your different, your color choices in a particular graph are different enough that people can tell the difference and how it's printed and whatever else. So that's really a great tool. So there you go. That's it for me. If you want to see vital signs, you can check out the website. And of course, Canva and Visme are there as well. So now I'm going to try and switch over the host. And who do I have to?
Send it to Liam.
Who's next? Liam. Okay. Let's see. There you are. Make host.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you, Isabel, for putting on this session and the Nexus Center. And thanks to my other presenters. I've learned a lot already this morning. I'll just share my slides here. So, what we've learned so far is that we might want not to be an academic in the context of data viz. And as Bones McCoy might say, damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor of sociology, not a graphic designer. And really that is, I think, where we sometimes are left with questioning ourselves as academics when we want to convey and visualize some of the data that we work with day in, day out as researchers. So I'm going to limit my comments to kind of how we think about this when we're considering publishing and disseminating research for primarily academic audiences. But obviously, I think as Kathy pointed out, there is, I think, an important imperative for us to also think these things through when we're trying to mobilize that knowledge into more general audiences as well. I won't touch on that as much, but some of the issues that I discuss will, relate to that question as well. It's not surprising, perhaps, that some of what I've going to focus on here has already been said, and that is this notion of simple clarity. I think is really at the root of what we want to think about when we are visualizing data. Because at the heart of this, we're social scientists. Maybe we're other sorts of researchers as well. But if we're working with some sort of quantitative data and doing perhaps quite sophisticated analyses of these things, we tend to have the habit of getting overcomplicated. Nicole highlighted this, showing the report about the courts in Manitoba, for instance. Things were maybe a bit text heavy at certain points, a bit cluttered, a bit the opposite of simple and clear. And I think we want to, as academics trying to communicate to different audiences, really have a focus on communicating clearly the so what of our message, right? That's really what you want as a writer, as a researcher, anybody to take away from your creation, right? And so that so what can be really added to by keeping your message simple and clear and using judiciously simple and clear visuals to help do that. The chances of a regular run-of-the-mill academic or doctoral student walking into their in-laws and seeing their publication sitting on their coffee table is probably a lot lower than what Kathy might experience with the vital signs report. But it should be something we maybe aspire to, is to be able to have our research be intelligible to those who are not even necessarily trained in more sophisticated quantitative methodologies. So one of the things that comes up in simplicity and clarity, I think, is this notion of trying to tell the story and show the differences that matter. So I'm showing an example here of a visualization that shows a difference that matters over time, shows a trend, but is easily interpretable. And what we can see in this graph from some research I've done about how Canadian foreign aid relates to gender equality is that the amount of aid programming over a number of years that is not related to gender equality is shrinking significantly, right? This graph is just a stacked bar graph with a percentage associated with each category, could easily be 7 different pie charts, right? If we think to Nicole's example of what not to do, those 2 pie charts side by side where you were kind of jumping back and forth could easily have been this sort of graph where you're easily able to see the trends and the differences that matter. That sort of simplicity and clarity, oftentimes repeating the same analysis multiple times over smaller units of time or smaller units of observation, is one really key way to tell your audience about the differences that matter. So in this case, the fact that over time, the way that we're attributing gender equality results to Canadian foreign aid is changing significantly. Telling stories over time is also really useful when you are able to, really highlight sharp increases, sharp changes in trends. And so, for instance, this is a figure from some research I've done on electoral quotas for women globally, and we can see easily from this story, which I could just write in a sentence, but it's much more easily captured for the reader here to see that between 1980 and 2010, we've seen an explosion of electoral quotas for women across the world, right? And here, this is a key point of that article. And while it could have just been buried as a sentence in a dense paragraph of statistics, a judicious use of a figure like this really easily tells the story to the reader that this is a difference that matters. Over time, we've seen this sharp increase in the phenomenon that we're interested in. So that sort of simplicity and clarity, I think, is really important to think about. The other thing we want to think about when we're considering data visualization is that we're really using these tools to help our reader. Usually in the context of an academic paper, maybe a doctoral thesis, a would-be peer-reviewed journal article, you're using these visualizations to help augment the story that's already there. The data, the issue you're addressing, you're already doing that in the text, but it is difficult for a reader to quickly pick that up, to quickly take that message away from that. And so one of the things that we come across as quantitative researchers is that we're very still oftentimes tied to the role of using regression results tables to show our quantitative social science results, right? So I'm going to give you an example from a recently published article of mine. This article published in the British Journal of Sociology last year with colleague Andrew Dawson from York University, looking at foreign aid and the diffusion of international law norms. And in that article, we have this table, right? And for those of you versed in regression results, you're probably very used to seeing these tables of results with asterisks all over to show what's significant and what's not, and range of other different metrics and measures. This, as a visualization, is still a visualization. It's not a very reader-friendly one. It doesn't really easily capture the story that we want to tell because it has everything here. It has all the results of 8 different regression models, right? That is expected in most academic journal articles of this variety when you're doing that sort of quantitative research, but it isn't immediately intelligible to a reader to pick out from this table, like, what is the key piece of information here, right? So instead of just focusing on one table of results like this, we go to visualize the key things that we think matter in this argument, and show what each specific type of foreign aid, what effect it has on these different measures of the rule of law in a meaningful measure. So instead of just saying, here's our regression estimate, we're saying in a predicted effect visualization like this, what the effect of doubling of aid in each of these categories would be on the change in these measures. So it's still sophisticated. You don't immediately pick this up from looking at this graph, but it captures material that is all in here and conveys it to the reader to be able to easily compare between these categories to see what matters where. And how what matters meets with tests of our statistical significance, with which social scientists are oftentimes quite fixated. The last thing I want to say, and I'm just plowing through this, so I'm happy to have more questions about any of this later, is this question of audience. And again, a refrain that's come up in both Nicole and Kathy's talk. The audience question for academics is complicated sometimes, because if you're trying to publish in high-end journals, your audience is oftentimes like 3 or 4 other researchers in the world who do exactly what you do in the same sophisticated way that you do it. And therefore, you're speaking this very, highfalutin quantitative language. And that's maybe great for those 4 or 5 people. But if you're presenting at a larger conference where you have a range of people in an audience, if you're presenting to a public sector body, if you're presenting to a group of students, for instance, even who are not maybe yet as literate with engaging with that high-end quantitative analysis, then you really need to consider how can we deal with communicating the things that matter in our analysis. So I'm drawing examples here from an article published in 2017 on gender quota adoption in the developing world. And in this paper, there's another one of these regression tables. This is only one of a couple of these in the paper, right? Commonly used. This one's got 6 models and, more variables than the kitchen sink, right? So it's, quite complicated, hard to pick out what you want from this result. There's nothing worse than going to a conference and having someone presenting on their research like this, and then a table like this pops up and you're sitting at the back of the room trying to figure out with your old person eyes, like, what is this table even saying, right? And trying to sift through the asterisks and things like this. And so in this sort of context, if you're presenting quantitative research in any sort of public audience, it's almost always the best bet to forego the regression results table. You might want to have it as an extra slide that you can come back to if there's some real data nerd in the audience who really wants to drill you on one specific coefficient. But it makes much more sense to have some sort of summary of this. So here we're summarizing all of the regression results tables in that paper to show the results that were statistically significant in the direction of the relationships based on the hypotheses. So this is a real simple communication of results that are in this table, but that shows that, if we look across these models, that, in particular, civil society representation at the Beijing conference really mattered, right? And that's, the message that we wanted to convey when we're presenting this to a more general audience. So taking things, simplifying it, distilling it down into the key pieces that matter is, I think a key thing when you're thinking about audiences, and then using these models to make predictions that matter. And so here we take the same results and we use key variables to predict the number of years that an average country would take to adopt an electoral quota. And we can see here, taking the same idea of having small multiples. So this is really like 4 separate bar graphs combined together, showing that as you change categories in these categorical variables, your time to quota adoption in a country shrinks. And that was the key message we wanted to convey, right? So you want it to be intelligible to an audience, easily to see the trend, easily to compare between categories, and really try to be able to tell that so what question that you're dealing with. You can get into obviously more sophisticated ways of doing this, and obviously some audiences may want to have more information attached in terms of the certainty with which you're making these predictions. But again, this is just a regression results table repurposed in a way to communicate the direction and magnitude of these results. Too often when we're doing quantitative social science, especially I see this in my students oftentimes, we get fixated on simply saying, there's a relationship, it's significant. And we don't really, spend enough time trying to tell the reader why that matters, how big that relationship is, what is the key message we can take away from that. And so when we're trying to communicate these things to different audiences, I think it's really important to think about ways you can distill this big piece of analysis you've done into those easily digestible visualizations that show the differences that matter and tell that so what story to your audience. And this, I think, is even more important when you are trying to translate that into public consumption. So, a lot of academics now are taking the step of communicating the results of their work through a policy brief or a one-pager that kind of communicates a 40-page article into a very easily distilled sort of chunk of information. And these sorts of principles around simplicity and clarity, helping your reader and knowing your audience, I think, are key things that you can use when you're trying to take that sort of approach. So I think I've gone a little over time. I'll stop here and pass to our final presenter. There you go, Michaela.
Thank you, and great talk, all of the previous people ahead of me. It's great hearing from other people and how people use data visualization. It's fantastic. So I am going to kind of be taking a little bit of a different approach when it comes to talking about this. So my name is Michaela Swain. I am a biology master's student, and I'm also the professional development coordinator for the BGSA. And I kind of want to go over, from a student's perspective, why using infographics to convey complicated research topics could be a good idea. And I think to do this, I kind of want to start with why I started to use an infographic. Going into the professional development coordinator position, I really wanted to find ways to better communicate research topics to the general public. As students, you spend a lot of time researching one kind of topic, and you become very knowledgeable and very passionate about it. And I found that when I was talking to my family and my friends and just general audiences about it, I would go down so many different rabbit holes, and it almost became too confusing for both me and the listener of what was the main information that I was trying to get across. The other thing on why I started using infographic was, as a student, you do spend a lot of time, and a lot of other students are spending a lot of time on their research, and there's a lot of great research coming out, but how do you make yours stand out? How do you make it look a little different? How do you, kind of move to the front of, okay, this is what I'm doing and why it's important? And then why would I use an infographic to solve this? And I think one of the main reasons was I actually did not know about infographics really right off the front. I had heard about them, but I never really thought about using them until someone suggested and said, oh, I'd love to learn more about infographics. And so I started researching and looking, and I found that they're really great visual representations of information. You can use visual aids and flow to really help capture the reader's attention. Visuals have this great ability to draw people in and help them remember and help them kind of better comprehend what you're going over. The other thing is you can use charts and images and graphs that you have to help drive home information that you're trying to communicate. The other reason why I like to use infographics is because they can either be very broad or very direct. My topic, I have one very broad overarching topic, but within that, there's a lot of subtopics that I go over. And the nice thing about infographics is I can make multiple. I can make ones that cover the overall topic of my project, but I also can make some that are more directed towards the specific paths of my project or directed towards research and results. An infographic doesn't always have to be just results-based. It also can be based off of helping someone learn about a topic. So when I started to do this, I spent hours looking at different sites and trying to find how to put my research into an infographic. There's great templates, but what words do I put into it? How do I make it flow? How do I make it capture someone's attention? And I kind of found, for me, a building block to step off of. These are three kind of steps that I was able to take and make an infographic. By filling out each of these three, I was able to plug it into a simple format and have an infographic by the end of it. So the first one is to have a topic or focus. What is the infographic about in the most broad sense? Without any generalization, what is its topic? Next is main points. These are just a few things that you want your reader to leave remembering. What is the information that it's necessary for the reader to learn to understand this topic, but also what's important about the topic itself? And then having a short description for each of these main points. It should only be a few sentences as to not clutter up the infographic, and it should be easy for anyone to read. You know, I really wanted to make infographics a way to share my research to my family and to friends and to general public so that they could easily understand it. And, you know, have my grandma be able to read it and not be confused. And that was something I continued to keep in mind as I was writing things of, okay, would my grandma understand this? You know, would someone who's never looked at this stuff really get it? So I'm going to kind of go through it step by step of how I took it. You know, this is a lot of, kind of how I've started to use it as a building block. And I'm hoping that it can maybe be a stepping stone that other people can look at these 3 steps and maybe start getting into infographics. So for topic or focus, mine is moose impacts on their ecosystem. Very broad, no real information in that. Next, I came up with main points. For me, I had 4 main points. The first being there are direct and indirect impacts. Second, there are 3 main direct impacts of moose. The third, the importance of understanding indirect impacts on soil. And the fourth being soil is a home to important microbial and insect communities. As you can see, it kind of starts off very broad, giving the information that someone might need to understand the rest of my main points. And then it goes into the more nitty-gritty of what my study is about. Lastly, I just wrote a short description for each of these main points, and I couldn't really fit it in this small box. But by filling out these three areas, I was able to have the basis of an infographic. So I was able to get a format, my topic or focus, that's my title. My main points, those made up my subheadings. And my short description for each main point, I was able to put as the description for each subheading. I was then able to put a couple of different figures and pictures to kind of capture the reader's attention to those different sections. And this is just a great kind of starting place. There's obviously ways that I can improve it, but as a starting step, this was a great way for me to see that I could spend, a little bit of time, write out what I wanted someone to know, and have a tangible finished product in front of me. So I kind of challenge you to think about your own research, your work or interests. It's just something that you are really passionate about or want to tell people about. Open up a Word document and try going step by step, filling out, just starting out very broad and starting to get more detailed and oriented as you get to the end. By the end of that, you really have all of the basics for an infographic. You just need to plug it into a format. And as you go on, you will find and get different ideas of how to make an infographic to flow better. I've been able to spend a lot of time on, okay, how do I want, if I make this infographic, how would I want it to flow? And it kind of gets you in and it gets you working with a site. Kathy did a great job talking about Canva, which is a site that I use constantly. And every infographic that is on here, I have built using Canva. And it is a really easy site to use. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a format or a template and I will strip it down to what I want. And I can then kind of play with it from there, add different graphics, add different pictures. But by using a template, I at least have the basis of what I need, the text boxes, maybe some of the backgrounds, things like that. And it becomes an easy way to kind of make a tangible finished project. And as you continue to work, and as I continue to work, I'm still learning every single day, and being a part of this roundtable has been really great because it's allowed me to learn more from people around me, and also to kind of push myself to continue learning and find places where I can become better. So I was able to continue to adapt that first infographic that I showed, and I have this infographic, which is where I'm at right now. This infographic still follows the same the three building blocks that I showed before, just in a little bit of a different layout. My topic is still my topic. I just made it capture and a little bit more intriguing for someone. And, my main points are still in there, just in a different format. As my project is about the cascading indirect impacts from moose to soil, I was able to visually show going from, the herbivore interactions to plants to soil. You can kind of visually get a better understanding. if I show this to my grandma, she'll better understand what I'm doing than me sitting for 30 minutes trying to talk to her and explain. And I think as students, it's a great thing to continue using and to learn. And even just normal everyday life, I think knowing how to use infographics and better visualization of topics and data can help with explaining things that are sometimes hard. So I really challenge you to try out these three, main points and see if you can make an infographic from this. And, if you do make one, I would love to see it at some point, and just see what you can make with it. I think the most interesting part of any infographic is the information that you put on it. And that's the real reason for an infographic. So it can get frustrating to know how to lay out, how to make it look good. But as long as you have that information on there, that's what's going to capture the reader's attention. That's what's going to make people remember. It's the information, not just the visuals. They're an aid to help. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This brings the end of the expert comments. Now this is the chance. This is your chance in the audience to ask any questions or comment on some of the points that were made during the presentations. So if anyone would like to use a chat function to write down their comments, or if you have a question, you can also use that function to just speak up or to have the little hand, raise your hand, and I will take it. So Matt, I see you first, so the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Milner. I'm work by day as a grant facilitator here in Humanities and Social Sciences, for those of you who don't know me. But by, I guess, other identities, I'm a digital historian. And I've been running workshops on data visualization before. And I thought I'd just maybe interject or just add some things to help people out with resources, because I've often get questions about what to use. Canva is a great thing. If you're another resource which is really, really interesting to look at, you might have seen some really cool visualizations in like the Washington Post or the New York Times, over the years, really interactive, or you might need a good place to brainstorm on how to lay out your stuff. There is a data library or JavaScript library called D3JS that powers all of those. And the great thing about that is, even if you're not interested or you don't want to learn how to do the coding, it's all open source. If you can actually download it and do it yourself if you want to learn. They have a great gallery. So it's really good. Like if you just need to have a good brainstorm about how to think about like, how can I lay this stuff out? We saw the great sort of dashboard that I think Nicole mentioned. D3JS actually has this wonderful collection of all of these different ways of looking at presenting and visualizing data. So I just kind of wanted to put that out to the group. And the other thing to add is, if you're using images, remember or look up to find out whether they're raster images or vector images. And what that simply means is a vector image can be resized really easily, and a raster image, you might have the poor resolution, right? So just think about those kinds of things when you're looking at your looking at putting stuff together. If you're doing data-driven stuff for qualitative, and you need someone to pick your brain about, I'm around. Just kind of putting that out there. That's what I do. But I don't know if anyone else is everyone's sort of talking about quantitative data, and there's not sort of the idea that the quality comes out in the text. It's like images are great for doing qualities too. So just thought I'd add those things. Oh, and last, there is a great, there are many resources for accessible colors, because web designers have to use them all the time. There's a site called ColorSafe that will actually help you. If you pick one color, it will tell you kind of what works well for people who have making different kinds of color choices for your stuff to help distinguish between colorblindness and other kinds of vision impairment.
Can I add something too about color? There's also sites where if you, like sometimes we have a client with a logo and we want to give that client reporting in their colors, there are sites you can go to identify the color codes of their color. Like you put in a website and it'll tell you what the color code is, so that when you go and you're making your graphs, you can use their colors, which is pretty handy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. I see there's a comment from Jennifer Selby asking if you could write the color code site in the chat section as well.
I was just going to do that.
That'd be wonderful.
I'm just going to put those links into the chat. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Do we have more questions or comments? Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the great presentation. It was really nice to kind of see the different areas of kind of research and different ways you can apply all this. But I was wondering, like, broadly, if there's any kind of graphs or anything like that that people are kind of avoiding now, or trying to be like, oh, like this isn't as useful. The one that kind of popped in my head is, Nicole, you showed a pie graph, and I kind of remember through my undergrad, they were like so frowned upon, and they were kind of said they were like the worst thing to use. I'm just wondering if that's still kind of the same idea, or if there's any other graphs that kind of maybe we should try to avoid.
You're so right. Pie graphs are controversial. They're like, oh my God, pie graphs. And in fact, there's a post, if you follow Anne Emery, who is Depict Data Studio. She has a blog, and she's kind of a big writer in visualizing data. And she posted yesterday about pie graphs because it was 3.14, it was March 14th.
Yeah.
Pi Day. So I think pie graphs are controversial, but people do talk about like how, because they're hard to see, obviously hard for the eye to perceive comparative sizes in that format. So that's true, but typically if you are using a small number of categories, and if you're not making your reader go down to the legends, like in that what not to do thing I showed, it was like they had the pie and then you had to like cross-reference the color by looking at the legend and going back, and you couldn't quite figure it out. I like to put like arrows, to say this represents this percentage. And I would only use it in situations where it wasn't really important for me to point out, like for the eye to easily perceive those differences, like I tend to use it as not decorative, but like in an ensemble of things when you need something a little bit different. And it's not like the key point of the graph is not, the relative difference and being able to easily perceive that. So
Okay.
it's used in certain circumstances. It's okay.
Would anybody else like to pitch in? Liam, go ahead.
I just see, I do agree with Nicole that the pie chart has kind of become the Comic Sans font of the graph world, right? It's, universally seems to be despised and whatnot, but it is, to its credit, a quite simple, straightforward way of showing, percent breakdown of a variable and or of a piece of data. And so even if you mightn't use them that often, you definitely want to be literate in being able to do that and be able to understand them, because they do obviously still get thrown around a lot in a lot of context. So I think one thing that I didn't talk about in this context was that I think these skills are increasingly important for students coming out of social sciences and humanities and the sciences in general, right? That if you look at the way in which communicating and analyzing data is kind of a core piece of jobs where you are doing research and writing and policy analysis and things like this, I think my impression over the past decade or so is that it's an increasingly desired skill set for students coming out of university and entering the professional context. So even if the pie chart is maybe fallen out of favor, being able to quickly whip one up or quickly interpret one is I think a skill that all students should have clearly.
Any other questions for our panel of experts? We still have a few more minutes. So I don't know, Liam, you brought up an additional point here about the transferability or the importance of developing those skills. So there's definitely a learning curve. I think that I'm still in the learning curve of Canvas. I'm not fast at whipping up even the blendest of pie chart. But there seems to be a true benefit is that once we get the hang of it, once we get to know how to do these infographics fairly rapidly, then it's easier and easier to create the next one and then the next one. And so there's definitely a benefit to learning that skill. So for those of you who are also debating, should I spend a weekend working on this or not, this is perhaps something to keep in mind.
I think, in some ways, Michaela's presentation highlights the extent to which practice and kind of diligence can kind of help you in certain ways here. And if we're all a little bit amateur graphics designer and all a little bit an amateur, communications person as well, then that helps you in pitching your work to the different audiences and things. But there's also opportunities for more formal training in this that are clearly coming. MUN is in the process of looking at the creation of a Masters of Data Science program, of which this sorts of thing would be a key piece. That'll be quite a technical program where, involving a lot of the coding and also the high level statistical analysis that goes behind it. But really, in terms of having transferable skills, as much as students might hate it when they have to take their required quantitative analysis course in their undergrad or in their master's program, I can see some of my grad students here. Even if you never think you're ever going to use some of these skills in your own research and going forward, they're really important skills, I think, in terms of being able to communicate thoughts and analysis generally, right? So, you might take some of these things with a bit of a grain of salt when you are forced to learn them or whatever. But when you think about transferable skills that you pick up in a university environment, this is I think a really critical and key one, and one that I think seems to be growing in importance. So, and it's not just the quantitative thing, as Matt indicated. It is something that high-end qualitative research, I think, can do really well as well in terms of helping communicate the key points rather than just having, pages upon pages of quotes from interviews and things like that, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can go about visualizing data that we haven't even touched on today in terms of timelines and network visualizations. And the thing where I think academia is still struggling to catch up is this notion of kind of interactive online dashboard style things that most social scientists aren't thinking about how their article in journal X is going to turn into interactive data visualization on their webpage or anything like that. We're not quite at that stage yet, although I think eventually we probably will head in that direction. So the sorts of resources Matt points out in that respect, I think, are really, really important as well.
Thank you for those comments. Yes.
I was just going to add to that. I think it is a really useful skill to have, not just for the data visualization piece, but the process of going through the data visualization exercise, getting your data to that point forces you to do the process that Michaela kind of laid out, that forces you to think linearly about about what you're trying to say. And so you don't get sidetracked with your tangents and you lose your audience at that point. So even just the process of kind of doing that is a really important skill, both for researchers, but also very much an important skill if you're going to transition into positions that are more policy oriented, that are more, even just in government, the ability to be able to take a report and boil it down to a page and a half, because that's what's going to be used. It's not the full report. The full report needs to be there for backup, but people aren't reading that. I mean, 101, first thing I had to do at a university was write a briefing note, and so to read a report and figure out what are the important things that you wanted to transfer off to other people. So being able to kind of, and that's part of what researchers do all the time with other people's research, but doing it with your own, I think, is a whole other step. So kind of looking at what are the really key takeaways that we want to hand off to people, what's going to be useful for people in the end, and making sure that that's in a really readable, your NAN understands it kind of way, because at least then you make sure that the information gets processed and gets put to good use.
Yeah, I definitely think you really do a great job of kind of highlighting. It does make you think a little further into what you're looking at and think about it on a more logical, linear scale. And I think that's important. As a student, I was very unsure going into infographics. I was like, how is this even going to, be something that's helpful for me? This is just going to be a waste of time. And as I started diving into it more, it was something that I found was really helpful, and even, has gotten me to here where I'm able to sit alongside some people who have done really amazing things, and I get to share this. And I think it's a great option for people to remember that this, maybe it's an infographic that works well, but maybe it's something else. And, going into my future, I do graduate upcoming, and this is something that I'm able to take coming forward, that I do have this skill. I have this skill of being able to turn research into a different aspect, and that I am continuing to learn, you know what I mean? And I think that's a great thing to constantly do, is learn from others and find ways that work well for you.
And, making a segue from Michaela's comments also, it's important to realize that this is a lot more shareable also on social media. So the last infographics you had with the moose and then the soil was very visually appealing. So even if I'm not a biologist, had I seen it on Twitter, I would have probably clicked on it because, there was a cute little moose on it. Whereas had you posted your latest article, perhaps I would have, ignore it because it's not quite in my immediate field of research. And so there's something there about making sure that our research gets read widely outside of our fields, not just, as Leanne was pointing out, to the 3 other people who are working specifically on this topic around the world, but broadly to people who are interested in ecology, interested in, broadly speaking, the world around us. So with this, then, I think that we're wrapping up our session. I would like to thank the 4 panelists who so kindly agreed in the middle of a lockdown to spend an hour and a half with us today. So thank you very much, Kathy, Nicole, Liam, and Michaela. Thank you for your contribution and your help to HSS faculty members and students. Now, for those of you who are interested in these issues, then follow the Nexus Center on Twitter and Facebook. There will be, we have 2 MUSUP students who will be posting a lot of material and a lot of helpful guidance as to things that have worked, little tips as to how to create infographics and data visualization. So we'll continue that discussion on social media as well in the coming days and weeks. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing interacting with you with the Nexus Center. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicole.